Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Everyone is holding their collective breath when Zimbabweans go to the polls on July 31st. Of course, a very important elections amid glitches and technical problems that could well derail the process and affect the ultimate outcome of the poll. Joining me tonight on Political Exchange is Ambassador Lindiwe Zulu. She is the Special Advisor of South Africa's President Jacob Zuma and has become South Africa's public face on the Zimbabwean political situation. Lindiwe, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
My pleasure, Karim.
Now, of course, we have already seen examples of some of these technical glitches. We know that some of the armed forces have already conducted the polls. The Zimbabwean Electoral Commission experiencing some initial problems. Analysts are concerned that if you multiply the responsibility in terms of just the amount of voting stations that they will have to manage, that they are not going to do so well. From the South African government's point of view, how confident are you that this process is going to be run with the kind of credibility that is required to ensure a result that will not be questioned in the final analysis?
Yes. The facilitator to the Zimbabwe process, President Jacob Zuma, of course, is concerned and gets reports all the time, almost on day-to-day basis on what is happening in Zimbabwe, because at the end of the day, the responsibility was given to him to facilitate, and SADC is the guarantor as well as the AU is the guarantor. Everyone is holding their breaths, as you rightfully say, we all are, but we are hoping that with the kind of deployment that has started happening on the ground of the SADC observers as well as the AU observers, something will have to be done. May I also just say that the President himself, as the facilitator, is engaging with the regional leaders who a month ago took a decision that they requested the Zimbabwe government to ask for an extension so that they could have been able to try and deal with some of the challenges and glitches that they are now having in as far as the elections are concerned. However, there's water under the bridge because everyone in Zimbabwe was preparing themselves for the elections. All the parties prepared themselves for the elections. So we hope that all the parties collectively will continue to engage with each other, despite obviously the fact that they are now campaigning for the elections.
Right.
That usually makes it a bit difficult for people to be calm about the situation, because campaigning for elections is where the challenge is. For SADC and for the facilitator, the most important thing which SADC has been calling all the time is to say that the elections must be conducted in an environment which is peaceful, in an environment that allows everyone to be able to campaign without intimidation and without any violence. And we can say that so far, to a large extent, that has reduced, but that does not necessarily deal with the logistics, deal with the challenges that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission will have to face when it comes to the bigger scale of elections.
Now, of course, the European Union has already indicated that it will take its lead from the SADC monitors and observers. Many people saying it's a victory for African diplomacy. But of course, that places a very big responsibility on those formations to ensure that all the parties are comfortable with the process. Given the fact that we've had elections that were severely compromised, some might even argue, say, stolen previously in this country, what is it that SADC has put in place amid its observers to ensure that they, A, will be able to have access to all the voting stations, that their people will be able to move around freely, and that they'd actually have the space to make an objective finding on the conditions in which this poll is set to take place?
Absolutely. SADC has decided that it will have quite a big contingent of observers, as well as the AU also has a bigger contingent than usual. The basis for which SADC is in Zimbabwe at the moment, first and foremost, must be understood by the fact that SADC itself has got guidelines to elections. And therefore, those guidelines is what they are able to use together with in discussion with the political parties to say these are the SADC guidelines which Zimbabwe itself also accepted and endorsed when these guidelines were adopted. Secondly, you'll be aware of the fact that SADC has already yesterday launched the arrival and the starting of the work by the observers, which gives us confidence. And what is important also is the fact that in its statements, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is leading of Tanzania, who is leading this observer mission, already in their statement, they repeated again the same issues that SADC has been repeating over and over again, that the elections must be held under a peaceful and conducive environment, that the elections must be free and fair and credible, because we think that's very important. And to a very large extent and a large degree, we believe that all the parties involved do want to find themselves creating that environment, because at the end of the day, none of the political parties in Zimbabwe want that at the end, whatever the results are, that the elections will end up being contested, because then, unfortunately, we are back to 2008. And therefore, what the facilitator is doing at the moment is, with the little reports that we are getting at the moment as to what is happening, he is already planning that something needs to happen amongst the leaders, particularly the Troika leaders, so that they can probably come together and have a discussion, because what SADC cannot afford is to wait until the end of all this.
Exactly.
And what is good is the fact that they are just having their special vote, which is like a prelude really to the bigger challenge of elections. And therefore, the facilitator is going to be looking at what exactly happened during the time of the special vote, so that in his engagement with the leaders of the region, he's able to say, this is the report that we are getting. And what is also good for the facilitator is that he's going to be getting reports not just from the political parties, but he will be getting reports from the Minister of Foreign Affairs together with his team. But also the facilitation team will be preparing to go to Zimbabwe to make sure that the team is also on the ground. And the team still has a responsibility to engage with the political parties, but also engage particularly with JOMIC, which is the Joint Monitoring Committee, which is a very important element of this whole process, because there were arguments about whether JOMIC should be the one that does any monitoring or anything of that sort. However, SADC Summit agreed that JOMIC must continue with that job.
Now, of course, many people are worried about the potential for violence, apart from the logistical nightmares around, access to the voters' roll and, people getting to and from the places, in conditions of relative peace. But violence is a big issue. It's hanging over the elections. Are the facilitators and SADC leaders satisfied that the armed forces in Zimbabwe have been sufficiently contained to not play a party political role and impact the extent to which threats of violence could act as a deterrent for people to come out, or in fact, create tensions in areas that could create situations of no-go, areas where people don't feel free to actually go and cast their vote?
To the extent that SADC can involve itself in that, the facilitation team and the facilitator himself has been holding on to the new constitution, for instance, that now covers what the armed forces should do according to the new constitution, what is expected of them in a period like this. That's the first thing. Secondly, SADC itself, the Secretariat is on the ground, and one of the things that the SADC Secretariat needs to engage with, not just the Secretariat alone, but the observer mission has to engage at that level to continue to say, we have been saying the armed forces must take responsibility in as far as ensuring that there's peace, security and stability, but not any interference whatsoever in as far as the polling stations are concerned. And may I also just say that one of the meetings that we had, which was a very fruitful meeting, was with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, where the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission itself raised this issue to us to say they have a responsibility of engaging to make sure that, unlike what happened in 2008, that does not happen. Obviously, this is a wish That is what we all want to see, and this is what the Zimbabwean people themselves want to see. It's one thing to want to see that, and it's another when the situation happens on the ground. We are just hoping that everybody would be reasonable, everybody would want to make sure that these elections are held under conditions that are free and fair, because I don't think that anybody in Zimbabwe today wants to see a repetition of 2008. I don't think the region as such wants to see that repetition, because we've been saying Zimbabwe needs to come back and find its space in the SADC region, and we are also saying that the SADC region must be a region that is exemplary to the entire continent, and therefore SADC cannot afford any blot of any instability, because at the end of the day we've seen the impact of that stability, and Zimbabwe itself is a living example of what actually happens when decisions that are taken are not implemented, when collective decisions where they agreed upon, we have the global political agreement. Had we had a situation where most of the agreements that they had done had been implemented, we wouldn't be in the situation in which we are in today. However, we are in this situation. We need to face it. We need to do the best that we can so that come the day of elections itself, we don't have any of these challenges.
Now, of course, the Zimbabwean election happened in the same period as we see incredible upheaval in the north of Africa, in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Egypt, where we saw a democratically elected government removed by armed forces amid, of course, massive upheaval on the streets. The AU was very firm, very quick to respond in terms of its own protocol, suspending Egypt, very clear that any route other than constitutional means to power will not be tolerated. And obviously that will be the same position here. Given what has happened in Egypt, particularly around the armed forces, how important, Lindiwe, is the conduct of particularly your armed forces in situations like this? What is the message that the facilitator and SADC, of course, want to send to Zimbabweans, particularly those that find themselves in the army around this particular period of elections?
We have said time to time that the Zimbabwe army in particular and the armed forces are very professional people. That we have said, we are on record saying that. We have said that we understand that the past period in which they thought that it's part of their responsibility to be engaged so much and so deeply with elections shouldn't happen now. And that's a message that's not only for Zimbabwe. I think it's a message for the entire region. It's a message for the entire continent, because the continent can't afford that anymore. However, we are clear that there's a lot of work that we still need to do, because if you look at the historical role that armies have been playing in the African continent, these are the results of the fact that for a very long time we had coups, for a very long time we had people who think that any time, any moment, they can take power anyhow. However, we are confident with the fact that the AU took such a historical decision to say no more, not anymore. The people of Africa must be respected, and of course the army knows exactly where it belongs. The army is an army armies are supposed to protect people. Armies are not supposed to be seen to be beating people around or stopping people when they are supposed to go and exercise their democratic right to vote. And we think that in the Zimbabwe situation, the fact that this topic has been out in the public and has been debated with difficulty sometimes, where some feel that it shouldn't be something that is discussed. We have said Africa cannot afford this thing anymore. Africans themselves need to be able to voice this thing out, that once there is a civilian rule, no army we shouldn't be having gun-toting people thinking that they will go around threatening anybody. We know that with the engagement with Zimbabwe, I think that the engagement was even understood by the army itself, because if you were to look at what they used to say 5 years ago and what they've been saying right now, there's very few of those voices which are still saying we are not going to do this. So it means the impact of the discussion and the fact that the discussion has been open and be allowed to be open has assisted to a very large extent.
And I suppose also